I've heard different people say that kind of what creativity is the merging of ideas, taking things that already exist and putting them together. I think what's interesting about the Pale Instant Report, as we talked about, was the fact that you were pulling this world that you already had, and pulling it together with a genre. It's not just like, oh, combining things you already that already exist, but it's like, oh, I already have this creative thing that I'm working on, and it's already mine, and I'm combining my ideas. And I guess I love that as well, because it's like sometimes I get the feeling when people talk about creativity being the merging of ideas, that's it's kind of undermining what creativity is. It's taking away the ownership, the authorship of it. It's like, oh, you're just, this is something a computer could do. But like, no, you're merging your ideas, and that's bringing that together is what created this series. I don't know. I guess I'm curious to kind of know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think because I've heard what you said, how it's described, and how it can, yeah, kind of almost belittle creativity. But I believe like creativity is it's a skill like anything else. Like I'm not really a believer in like inherent talent, right? I think it's something that you train, and like any skill. And creativity is the same. Where to me, like I've always loved, like as a kid I loved books, and reading books, and I loved movies and TV shows and games. And so I think constantly surrounding myself with creative works, and then kind of going in my in my head, before I started writing, and just being like, well, what's something I would like to see set in this world, right? Like I love Star Wars, and I would always imagine stories set in that world. um and the same with other franchises and other pieces of media. But when it comes to writing it out, well, maybe I really like Star Wars, and so I want to do a space kind of story, sci-fi, science fantasy, whatever. Well, if I'm going to write it out and put all this work into it, like it does need to stand out from its source material. And there's a lot of ways of going about that. Like I can look back and say, okay, well, I want to tell a story about like rebels fighting an empire. That's cool. Well, like what inspired George Lucas? And it requires research. I think that's a big part of my creative process, is also just doing research and saying, oh, well, like this is based on this. And a lot of people haven't really looked into this. And maybe that's a good setting. Like I think even mythology, like for creating fantasy worlds, I think we see so many fantasy worlds that understandably are based off of like Greek mythology or Egyptian mythology or stuff that like maybe a lot of people are familiar with. But maybe even asking yourself, well, what if I look at, some other, old religious or old mythological stories, and kind of try to, play around with that. And I think it's like I said, it is a skill, and for me it's a long process. Like I can take months and months before I'm like, you know what, I'm settled on this idea for this. Um, and so it is like it is just a long, like I said, it's a long and it's a very personal process. Like it's hard for me sometimes, I think, to give advice, because I think it is very personal for me. Um, and I think it's personal for everyone who is creative.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess I love that you talk about like the research that goes into like before you write something like that requires kind of an interest in history and thinking about where ideas come from, and that like good writing is conscious of that. And it like the more curious you are about history and the history of literature and ideas and thought and how they progress, that gives you such an edge. And I guess I love the idea of that affecting your work and trying to think about like, yeah, well, I'm inspired by Star Wars like you said, but what is Star Wars drawing from?